The blood wouldn't stop. It leaked through Private First Class Charlie Owen's fingers as he pressed them against his abdomen, pooling on the steel floor of the Sherman tank repair bay. His skin had gone ghostly pale, contrasting with the dark smears of engine grease across his forearms. 3 days earlier, 10,000 American soldiers of the 3rd Armored Division had crossed the Rhine, their tanks intact, their advance unstoppable. But the mechanic who made it possible was dying, alone, on a makeshift cot in a Belgian field hospital. No medals adorned his chest, no commendation would bear his name. Just the slow, inevitable shutdown of his organs from toxic exposure, while officers debated whether his actions constituted heroism or court-martial-worthy insubordination. "How long?" whispered the field surgeon to the nurse. "Hours," she replied. The chemical burns damaged everything inside. Liver, kidneys, lungs, all shutting down. Charlie Owens stared at the canvas ceiling, his breathing shallow and very labored, eyes glassy but still somehow alert. How does a 23-year-old tank mechanic from Tulsa end up the reason an entire armored division still exists, yet pay for it with every cell in his body? What drives someone to risk everything when doctrine, training, and direct orders all point in the opposite direction? The story begins 3 weeks earlier, in the frozen mud of Belgium, February 1945. The snow fell in thick, wet clumps, coating the endless line of Sherman tanks that had ground to a halt along the narrow country road. The 3rd Armored Division, spearhead to those who served in it, was facing a crisis that threatened to derail the Allied push toward the Rhine. Their tanks were failing catastrophically, breaking down in numbers that headquarters could no longer ignore or explain away. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Walsh stood quietly in the freezing rain, watching as yet another M4A3 Sherman was hauled off the road, its engine seized completely. It was the 27th tank lost in 3 days, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failure. German 88s hadn't stopped them, but their own equipment was doing what the Wehrmacht couldn't. "The official diagnosis, sir?" asked the maintenance captain, rainwater streaming from his helmet. "Command says it's operator error," Walsh replied, his breath visible in the frigid air. "They claim our boys are pushing the engines too hard, not following proper warm-up procedures." But Charlie Owens knew better. For weeks, he had been voicing concerns about the new oil mixture being used in the Sherman's radial aircraft engines. Standard operating procedure dictated that all tanks receive the officially approved lubricant from Central Supply, a special cold-weather formula supposedly engineered for winter conditions. But after examining dozens of failed engines, Charlie had noticed something alarming. The new formula was breaking down under sustained operation, becoming corrosive to the engine's aluminum components. "The rules are clear," barked Captain Hargrove when Charlie first brought his concerns to the maintenance command. "We use what supply sends us. End of discussion. You think some private from Oklahoma knows better than the engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground?" So the failures continued, and with them the official explanation. The tank drivers were blamed. Their training was questioned. But the brutal truth was that if the 3rd Armored couldn't get its tanks operational, the planned Rhine crossing would fail before it began. And without that crossing, thousands more infantry would die trying to secure bridgeheads against entrenched German positions. It was in this atmosphere of mounting crisis that Charlie made a discovery that would change everything and ultimately cost him his life. Working late one night on yet another failed engine, illuminated only by a single hanging bulb in the makeshift repair tent, he noticed something peculiar about the corroded valve assemblies. The pattern of damage reminded him of something he'd seen back in Tulsa, where he'd worked on oil field equipment before the war. "It's not just that the oil is breaking down," he told his fellow mechanic, Corporal Frank Danner. "It's reacting with something, like it's been contaminated." What happened next would never appear in any official Army report. Under cover of darkness, Charlie began collecting samples of the standard-issue oil from different supply batches. Using improvised testing methods, heating the oil in empty ration cans over small flames, mixing it with various solvents, even tasting minute amounts despite the risks, he confirmed his suspicions. The cold weather formula had been contaminated with a chemical additive that became corrosive when heated beyond a certain temperature. The engines were literally being eaten from the inside. But his most shocking discovery came when he traced the supply chain back through divisional records. The contaminated oil had come from a single batch, one that had passed all standard quality checks. How was this possible? The answer came from an unlikely source, a German prisoner who had worked in synthetic oil production before being drafted. When shown a sample during an interrogation about fuel supplies, he immediately identified a signature smell. Sabotage, the prisoner explained in broken English. Chemical time bomb. Wait for cold, wait for engines work hard, then. He made a small exploding gesture with his fingers. It was an ingenious act of industrial sabotage. A German agent had introduced a dormant contaminant into a specific production batch, knowing it would only activate under winter combat conditions. By the time the pattern was recognized, it would be too late. Hundreds of tanks would be inoperable at a critical moment in the Allied advance. Armed with this knowledge, but lacking official channels to address it, the division was 48 hours from the planned Rhine crossing. Charlie made a decision that crossed every line in the maintenance manual. He proposed creating an alternative engine oil mixture using components he could scavenge. Hydraulic fluid from half-tracks, cooking oil from the mess tents, and a specific chemical solvent used for cleaning machine guns. "You can't be serious," Danner said, staring at Charlie's improvised mixing station hidden behind the repair tents. "This isn't just against regulations, it's against laws of physics. These engines aren't designed for this witch's brew." "Maybe not," Charlie replied, his face illuminated by the small fire heating his mixture. "But they're definitely not designed for what's killing them now." He looked up at Danner, his expression grave. "We've got 4,000 men and 243 tanks in this division. If they try to cross that river with failing engines, how many make it back?" The weight of this question hung in the cold Belgian air. Both men knew the stakes. The 3rd Armored wasn't just any unit. It was the spearhead of the First Army's thrust into Germany. They had already fought their way across France, through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, and now stood at the threshold of Germany itself. The Rhine crossing would put them directly in the path of desperate German forces trying to protect their homeland. Charlie's plan was audacious and entirely unauthorized. He would systematically replace the contaminated oil in as many tanks as possible, focusing first on the lead elements of the division. Working through 2 straight nights without sleep, he and a small group of trusted mechanics drained and refilled 38 tanks with his improvised mixture. The process was grueling. Each Sherman required over 20 gallons of the mixture. The men worked in darkness, using only shielded flashlights to avoid drawing attention. Their hands went numb in the freezing temperatures as they drained the old oil, flushed the systems, and carefully added Charlie's formula. The chemical solvent that made the mixture work, the same chemical that would eventually kill Charlie, burned their skin on contact, leaving raw patches that stung in the cold air. "If this works," Corporal Danner said as they finished the last tank before dawn, "you'll have saved the division." "And if it doesn't," Charlie replied, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, "I've sabotaged 38 perfectly good tanks and violated about 15 different regulations." The prospect of court-martial hung over Charlie like the sword of Damocles. Tampering with military equipment during wartime could be considered sabotage, the same charge the German agent who contaminated the original oil would face. The irony wasn't lost on Charlie, who had spent the night telling jokes to keep his team's spirits up as they worked through exhaustion and cold. The moment of truth came at 0400 hours on March 7, 1945, when the first wave of Shermans from the 3rd Armored rumbled toward their crossing points on the Rhine. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect conditions for the sabotaged oil to do its deadly work. As the column advanced, everyone waited for the first catastrophic engine failure. The Rhine crossing was no minor operation. It represented one of the final major barriers to the Allied advance into Germany's industrial heartland. The failure of the tank divisions would mean infantry crossing under fire, thousands of casualties, and weeks of delay, all while the Soviet forces approached from the east. The strategic implications were enormous, extending beyond the immediate battle to the very shape of post-war Europe. The first 30 minutes of movement were excruciating for Charlie and his team. They stood in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the rumble of Sherman engines growing fainter as the tanks moved toward the river. Each cough or sputter from an engine sent a spike of fear through them. Had they made a terrible mistake? Would the tanks begin failing one by one, leaving their crews stranded in the killing zones along the Rhine's eastern bank? The radio crackled to life at 0437. "Crossing point Alpha secure," came the voice of a tank commander. Then, a few minutes later, "Crossing point Bravo established. Opposition minimal. Tanks performing well." It never came. The tanks treated with Charlie's mixture not only functioned, they performed better than expected. The mixture worked better than expected. It improved cold weather starting and reduced engine wear under heavy load. Word spread quickly through the maintenance units, and with tacit approval from frontline officers desperate for functioning tanks, Charlie's team worked frantically to convert more vehicles before the main assault. By morning, 92 tanks had been modified with Charlie's formula. That day, the 3rd Armored Division punched through German defenses with overwhelming mechanized force, suffering 0 engine failures despite the extreme operating conditions. The crossing succeeded beyond all expectations, with Allied forces establishing a bridgehead that would ultimately allow 17,000 troops to cross within 48 hours. "It's like the tanks are running better than new," reported one tank commander over the radio. "Whatever maintenance did, tell them to keep doing it." The division's commanding officer, Major General Maurice Rose, noticed the dramatic improvement in vehicle performance. When told about Charlie's unauthorized modification by a nervous maintenance officer, Rose reportedly replied, "I don't care if he's brewing that oil with magic spells. If it keeps my tanks moving, he has my blessing." But Charlie's triumph came at a terrible cost, one he had anticipated but hidden from his fellow mechanics. The key ingredient in his oil mixture, the chemical that prevented the corrosive reaction, was a powerful solvent known to be toxic with prolonged exposure. While his team used gloves and makeshift masks when handling it, Charlie had worked barehanded through those crucial nights, his skin absorbing the chemical as he mixed batch after batch of his life-saving formula. The solvent, a derivative of carbon tetrachloride used for cleaning heavy weapons, had properties that neutralized the corrosive agent in the contaminated oil. Charlie had discovered its effectiveness through methodical experimentation, testing dozens of available chemicals until finding one that worked. But he also knew from his civilian experience that prolonged exposure caused liver damage, having seen it in oil workers back home. The military technical manuals listed it as hazardous to skin contact, but didn't specify the long-term effects of absorption, information Charlie had learned firsthand in Tulsa. "You need to wear the rubber gloves when handling this stuff," he'd told his team. All the time, no exceptions. But as the deadline approached and supplies ran short, Charlie had made the calculation that would ultimately cost him his life. There weren't enough gloves for everyone, and someone needed to mix the batches by hand to maintain consistency. The symptoms appeared less than 24 hours after the crossing. First came the dizziness, which Charlie attributed to exhaustion. Then the nausea and abdominal pain, which he dismissed as normal reactions to the stress and cold. But when he began vomiting blood during a maintenance check on the 3rd day, even he couldn't deny what was happening. "Why didn't you use protection?" the field doctor asked 3 days after the crossing, examining Charlie's yellowing skin and the chemical burns spreading across his torso. "Didn't have enough gloves for everyone," Charlie replied simply, "and we were running out of time." Charlie had known the risks from the start. In Tulsa, he had seen men suffer similar symptoms after exposure to industrial chemicals, but he had calculated a different equation, his life against thousands. A single mechanic versus an entire armored division. One man's future against the momentum of the Allied advance into Germany. As Charlie lay in the field hospital, the division he had saved continued its advance. The Shermans of the 3rd Armored rolled through German towns and villages, their engines purring with Charlie's mixture, the crews unaware of the dying man who had kept them moving. In 3 days, they advanced 51 miles, capturing critical bridges, rail yards, and supply depots. German resistance crumbled before the unexpected mechanical reliability of the American armor. As news of Charlie's condition spread, the division headquarters found itself in an impossible position. His unauthorized modification had undeniably saved the division's offensive capability, perhaps shortening the European war by weeks. Yet he had violated direct orders, improvised with critical equipment, and bypassed the entire chain of command. Captain Hargrove, who had dismissed Charlie's initial warnings, now stood awkwardly at his bedside in the field hospital. "We've submitted your name for a commendation," he said, his voice hollow with guilt. "There's talk of a Silver Star." Charlie tried to smile, but the pain made it more of a grimace. "Better make it quick, sir." The irony was palpable. The same officers who had threatened him with court-martial were now discussing medals. The same engineers who had dismissed his concerns were now studying his formula. The same system that had failed to detect the sabotage was now scrambling to document Charlie's solution. Back in the motor pool, Corporal Danner had been ordered to document Charlie's formula, now unofficially dubbed Owen's Mix, which was being implemented across the entire 3rd Armored. Engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground had arrived to study the composition, amazed that a private with no formal education beyond high school had solved a problem their laboratories had missed. "How did you know it would work?" one of the engineers asked Danner. "The chemical interactions are incredibly complex." "Charlie just knew machines," Danner replied, staring at the rows of Sherman tanks being prepared for the push into Germany. "Said he could feel when something was wrong, like they were talking to him." This intuitive understanding of machinery was something Charlie had possessed since childhood. Growing up in Tulsa, he had dismantled and rebuilt his father's tractor at age 12. During high school, he had worked at a local garage, developing a reputation for solving mechanical problems that stumped more experienced mechanics. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Charlie had enlisted immediately, his mechanical skills making him a natural fit for the armored divisions. "He could hear things in engines that the rest of us couldn't," recalled another mechanic who had worked with Charlie in North Africa and France. "Sometimes he'd just put his hand on a Sherman's hull, close his eyes, and tell you exactly what was wrong inside." In the 72 hours after the Rhine crossing, the 3rd Armored advanced 37 miles into German territory, capturing 2,000 prisoners and destroying 31 enemy tanks. The division's M4A3 Shermans performed flawlessly, their engines protected by Charlie's improvised formula. Tank commanders reported improved performance in the cold and better acceleration under fire, critical advantages that saved countless American lives during urban combat. But at the Belgian field hospital, Charlie Owens fought his final battle alone. The chemical damage to his liver and kidneys was irreversible. His lungs filled with fluid as his respiratory system began to fail. The doctors had done everything possible, but medicine in 1945 had few answers for acute chemical poisoning. "He knew," the nurse told Lieutenant Colonel Walsh during a quiet moment outside Charlie's tent. "From the beginning, he knew what would happen to him. He asked me about the symptoms, how long he had before they'd become debilitating." Walsh nodded silently, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. He had authorized the continued use of Charlie's formula after seeing the initial results, turning a blind eye to its unauthorized development. That decision had saved his division, but cost the life of a young mechanic from Oklahoma. "Was it worth it?" Walsh asked, almost to himself. "Trading one life for thousands?" The nurse studied him for a moment before answering. "That wasn't your choice to make, Colonel. It was his." Indeed, Charlie had made his choice with clear eyes. When Danner had confronted him about working without protection, Charlie had shrugged it off. "Someone has to mix the batches," he'd said. "Better me than you. You've got that girl waiting back in Philadelphia." In his final hours, Charlie drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally startling awake with concern about the tanks. "Did they check the intake valves?" he'd ask, or "the viscosity needs adjusting for the hill terrain." Even dying, his mind remained fixed on the machines and the men who operated them. Sergeant Miller, a tank commander whose Sherman had been among the first treated with Charlie's mixture, sat beside his bed through the night. "My crew is alive because of you," he told the failing mechanic. "We took direct fire from an 88 at Remagen. Engine gave everything we needed to get behind cover. Old formula? We'd have stalled right there in the kill zone." Charlie tried to focus on Miller's face, his vision already clouding. How many tanks are running now? 179, Miller replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. Nearly the whole division. They're all using your formula. The advance hasn't stopped. We're 20 miles past the Rhine now. A ghost of a smile crossed Charlie's pale face. Worth it then, he whispered. His last coherent words were instructions about the formula, specific ratios to adjust for different temperatures, warnings about storage conditions, modifications for different engine types. The attending doctor wrote it all down, recognizing that even in death, Charlie was trying to save others. Charlie died at 04:27 hours on March 12, 1945, exactly 5 days after the Rhine crossing he had made possible. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, though the citation carefully avoided mentioning his unauthorized modifications, instead praising his exceptional technical contributions to the division's operational readiness. The medal arrived at the Owens family home in Tulsa 3 months later, delivered by a solemn-faced Army captain who offered few details about the circumstances. Charlie's mother wore it on a chain around her neck until her own death in 1968. His father kept the accompanying letter in his wallet, the paper worn thin from being unfolded and refolded thousands of times over the years, a tangible connection to the son who never returned. He saved them all, Mr. Owens would tell visitors, pointing to the medal displayed in their modest living room. He saved them all, and most never even knew his name. The real story spread through the Tanks Corps in whispers. Tank commanders of the 3rd Armored held a private ceremony at which they placed a modified spark plug from a Sherman on Charlie's grave, a mechanic's Medal of Honor. For months afterward, many crews kept small vials of Owens mix in their tanks as talismans. The official report on the 3rd Armored's engine failures eventually acknowledged possible contamination of lubricant supplies, but placed the blame on storage conditions rather than sabotage. Charlie's formula was quietly analyzed, improved upon with laboratory testing, and incorporated into new specifications for cold weather operations, though never under his name. Corporal Danner, who had worked alongside Charlie through those crucial nights, kept detailed notes on everything they'd done. They want to pretend it was all according to procedure, he wrote in his journal. They want to erase the fact that a 23-year-old private from Tulsa saved an entire armored division by breaking every rule in the book. By May, when Germany surrendered, the story of the mechanic who saved 10,000 men had already begun to fade from official memory. The urgent push of war allowed little time for commemoration, and the Army had little incentive to highlight a case where a private had succeeded where its engineers had failed. The narrative of victory preferred heroes who fought with guns, not wrenches, who died from enemy fire, not chemical exposure from improvised solutions. What makes a person choose certain death to save others? For Charlie, perhaps it wasn't a single dramatic moment of decision, but rather the culmination of who he had always been. Former classmates remembered him as the boy who had once jumped into a frozen pond to rescue a stranger's dog, or who had spent 3 days repairing the town doctor's car for free during an influenza outbreak so he could reach remote patients. He just couldn't walk away from a problem once he saw it, his father told a local Tulsa newspaper after receiving Charlie's effects, especially not when other people would suffer if he did. The tanks of the 3rd Armored, with their engines protected by Charlie's formula, continued their advance into the heart of Germany. They were present at the liberation of Nordhausen concentration camp in April, where their crews witnessed firsthand the horrors they were fighting to end. By war's end, the division had captured 86,000 German prisoners, destroyed 706 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 2,000 other vehicles. In the chaos of the war's final weeks, few connected these victories to the quiet sacrifice of a single mechanic. Yet without functioning engines, without Charlie's insane solution, many of these tanks would never have crossed the Rhine, never have reached those objectives, never have saved those prisoners. Corporal Danner, promoted to sergeant after the Rhine campaign, kept meticulous notes on Charlie's formula and methodology. After the war, he provided these to Charlie's parents in Tulsa, along with a handwritten letter signed by 78 tank crew members who believed they owed their lives to their son. He could have reported the problem through channels and waited, Danner wrote in his personal journal. That would have been the proper procedure. But proper procedure would have meant failed tanks, failed crossing, failed offensive. Charlie chose a different path, knowing exactly what it would cost him. In the years after the war, several advances in synthetic oil formulation were quietly derived from studying Charlie's improvised mixture. The chemical interactions he had identified through intuition and hands-on experience would later be confirmed through laboratory analysis, leading to improved cold-weather performance in both military and civilian engines. Dr. Robert Milligan, who headed the Aberdeen Proving Grounds post-war analysis of the formula, would later admit to a colleague, "If Owens had submitted this through proper channels, it would have been rejected immediately. The theoretical models predicted it would cause catastrophic engine damage, yet it worked better than anything our labs had developed in 3 years of research." The irony wasn't lost on those who knew the full story. The same army that had threatened Charlie with court-martial now studied his formula in secret. The same engineers who had dismissed his concerns as those of an uneducated mechanic now built their careers on understanding his innovation. The same supply system that had failed to detect sabotage now claimed credit for the improved formula that replaced it. They called it the M4CR lubricant enhancement when they standardized it in '47, recalled Master Sergeant Wilson, who had served with the 3rd Armored. But those of us who were there at the Rhine still called it Owens Mix. Always will. One engineer at a post-war petroleum company who had served with the 3rd Armored's maintenance battalion would later write, "Owens understood instinctively what took us years to verify scientifically. His mixture shouldn't have worked according to the textbooks. But it did, and understanding why revolutionized our approach to synthetic lubricants." Charlie's younger brother, Thomas, who had been 16 when the telegram arrived at their Tulsa home, would follow in his footsteps as a mechanic. After the war, using knowledge pieced together from Charlie's letters and Corporal Danner's notes, he established a small but successful engine repair shop that specialized in difficult cases other mechanics couldn't solve. "Charlie always said that engines talk to you if you know how to listen," Thomas told a local reporter in 1962. "He taught me that before he shipped out. Said that the key was respecting the machine. Not trying to force it to do what the manual says it should, but understanding what it's actually doing and why." That philosophy, looking beyond manuals and procedures to the underlying reality, was perhaps Charlie's greatest legacy. It lived on not just in the improved formulas derived from his mixture, but in the mindset he represented, the refusal to accept official explanations when they contradicted observable facts, the willingness to trust hands-on experience over theoretical models, the courage to act when bureaucracy failed. Yet perhaps the most telling testament to Charlie Owens' sacrifice came 50 years later at a reunion of 3rd Armored Division veterans. When asked about the Rhine crossing, an elderly tank commander pointed to a small vial hanging from his keychain, still containing a few drops of dark liquid. "Everyone talks about the big heroes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "the ones who charged machine gun nests or jumped on grenades. But sometimes heroism is quieter. Sometimes it's a kid from Oklahoma who understands engines, who sees a problem no one else can solve, and who gives everything to fix it." In the pantheon of World War II heroes, Charlie Owens remains largely forgotten by official history. No books chronicle his innovation. No movies dramatize his sacrifice. His name appears on no memorials except the simple military headstone in that Belgian cemetery. Yet his impact ripples through history, in the lives of the 10,000 men who crossed the Rhine that day, in their children and grandchildren who exist because tanks didn't fail at critical moments, in the shortened war that saved countless lives on both sides. The question lingers: how many other Charlie Owens existed throughout the war? How many nameless men and women made critical contributions that never made it into the history books? The mechanics who kept planes flying through impossible conditions. The field medics who developed improvised treatments when supplies ran out. The radio operators who found ways to maintain communications when official equipment failed. Today, if you visit certain tank restoration workshops where enthusiasts rebuild World War II-era Shermans, you might notice an unusual tradition. Before starting a restored engine for the first time, some old-timers place a drop of oil on the ground and whisper a name: Charlie Owens, the mechanic who saved an armored division with an impossible fix, who chose to save others rather than himself, who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with knowledge, courage, and sacrifice. For those who study the technical history of World War II, Charlie's story raises uncomfortable questions about innovation in bureaucratic systems. How many other solutions died on requisition forms? How many lives might have been saved if expertise had been valued over protocol? These questions echo beyond that Belgian field hospital, beyond the mud and snow of 1945, into our own time. And for those who wonder about the true meaning of courage, perhaps there's something to learn from a young mechanic who understood the cost of his actions yet proceeded anyway. In the great accounting of valor, we remember the charge, the assault, the moment of violent bravery. But courage also lives in the quiet moments, in the careful mixing of chemicals by lamplight, in the knowledge of approaching death accepted calmly for the sake of others, in the final thoughts of a dying man still concerned for tanks and crews he would never see again. What would you do if you possessed the knowledge to save thousands, but implementing it would cost you everything? Would you have the courage to make Charlie's choice? Would you trade your future so others could have theirs? This is the question that haunts Charlie's story, a question without an easy answer. It's easy to celebrate his sacrifice in retrospect, to see the lives saved and the victory achieved. But in that frozen Belgian repair tent, with nothing but intuition and improvised tests to guide him, the calculus wasn't so clear. Charlie couldn't know for certain his mixture would work. He couldn't be sure the sabotage theory was correct. He acted on faith in his own abilities, on trust in what his hands and eyes told him about those failing engines. He had a certainty about him, Corporal Danner would later recall. Not arrogance, just certainty. When he said he'd figured it out, you believed him, even though what he was suggesting went against everything we'd been taught. That certainty, the confidence to trust one's own observations over official doctrine, is rare in any context, but particularly in military settings where hierarchy and procedure dominate. It requires not just technical skill, but moral courage, the willingness to risk punishment and failure for what you believe is right. We're trained to follow orders, reflected Lieutenant Walsh years after the war. The whole military system is built on that principle. But sometimes, very rarely, the right thing to do is to break the rules. The hard part is knowing when those moments are. For Charlie Owens, that moment came in the frozen darkness of a Belgian ninter, with the fate of an armored division hanging in the balance. He made his choice, mixed his formula, and changed the course of the 3rd Armored's advance into Germany. As the 3rd Armored Division pushed deeper into Germany in those spring days of 1945, few of the tank crews knew the full story of the mechanic who had made their advance possible. They knew only that their engines ran smoothly through the cold, that they could push harder without fear of breakdown, that they could outmaneuver and outfight the enemy with newfound reliability. The tanks churned through mud and snow, crossed rivers and fields, their tracks leaving imprints on German soil. Each mile a testament to Charlie's sacrifice. Each functioning engine a monument more meaningful than any stone marker could ever be. The mechanics who served alongside Charlie would carry his story forward, telling it in whispers at first, then more openly as the decades passed. They spoke of him not as a tragic figure, but as an exemplar of their craft, someone who understood that their job wasn't just maintenance, but the preservation of lives that depended on functioning machinery. A tank isn't just steel and oil, one former 3rd Armored mechanic would tell his apprentices in the 50s. It's the home and protection for 5 men. When you fix an engine, you're not just repairing metal, you're saving those 5 lives, over and over, every time that tank goes into combat. If this story stayed with you, perhaps take a moment to remember those whose sacrifices never made the headlines, whose heroism came not in a blaze of glory, but in the patient application of skill and knowledge. The mechanics, the medics, the radio operators, the countless support personnel who made victory possible, often at terrible personal cost. Their stories may be quieter, but they deserve to be remembered just as much as any battlefield charge. The tank columns of the 3rd Armored rolled across the Rhine and into Germany, their engines running on a mixture never found in any manual. And, in a small military cemetery under the Belgian sky, lies the man who made it possible. His grave marked not with tales of his innovation, but simply with a name, rank, and date. Yet for those who know where to look, who understand what really happened in those critical days before the Rhine crossing, a small, unofficial addition can sometimes be found placed upon his headstone, a single, weathered spark plug from an M4A3 Sherman tank. Continue exploring these quiet contradictions that define humanity's darkest and most illuminating hours.